All right, so we can go ahead and get started. So I'm very happy that this is the last webinar of the year. This is a really special webinar. We're really happy that Skyler Thomas was able to join us today. So hi.
Hi. Very happy to be here.
All right, so the format of this one is I'm going to give a bit of an intro about the topic that Skyler is speaking about, to put it in a context that I think is important, both a historical context and also the context of the present day fight against climate change. And then we'll watch a video that he prepared for this talk, for this webinar. And then we'll follow that with a Q&A segment. So a little bit of housekeeping. On Zoom, we have the chat function and we have the Q&A function. So if you guys want to comment, talk about things amongst yourselves, feel free to use the chat. If you want to ask questions for Skyler or for me, put that in the Q&A segment, and I'll be relaying your questions after the video. All right. And so I am also today going to give a little bit more of a background on Seed the Commons as well. In the past webinars, usually, I do that in barely a sentence. And today I'm going to also give more of an intro on that to explain why this topic, the Tule elk and Point Reyes, has been so important to us, why it's been something that we've come back to repeatedly. All right. So first of all, for those who don't know, Skyler Thomas is a local activist. He used to be a teacher. Now he's a filmmaker. He has more than 30 film credits. And one of the films that he made is The Shame of Point Reyes, which covers the conflict between dairy farming and native wildlife, especially the Tule elk in Point Reyes National Seashore. I know that a lot of people who follow Seed the Commons are not in California. So Point Reyes National Seashore Park is a park that's just a little bit north of San Francisco. And the Tule elk are a native animal here. So he made an important film about that. Now, the Tule elk and the situation in Point Reyes is something that we've spoken about and written about quite a bit over the past years. Earlier on in this webinar series, we had George Werthner, who is an ecologist who works with Western Watershed Project. He spoke on this panel. His talk was a bit more broad about grazing on public lands in the Western United States, but we touched upon the situation in Point Reyes. Some years ago at the forum that we used to organize on radical food politics, we had another Western Watersheds Project person, Karen Klitz, came and spoke. And this is something that I've brought up in talks and in writing. And so one of the things that I've said in the past webinars as I've introduced Seed the Commons is that we're a small grassroots organization in San Francisco. And one of the things that we've done really is hold events and do, educational things to build awareness, but also empower people to become active on various issues, be it GMOs, be it other things. And so one of these issues is this local fight against the Tule elk. And the fact that we've spoken about this has helped build awareness, both locally, but also for people who are not local, and get more activists involved on the ground. So in that sense, it's been a success in terms of our attempt to build up tools and inspiration for people to actually get active on various issues. So that's one of the reasons we want to continue talking about this. But it's really actually more than a local issue. And that's why I really hope that some of the people who are here today are not from California, but from elsewhere. What's happening in Point Reyes is an example of a conflict that is much broader in scope, that it repeats itself throughout the Americas and beyond. And shedding light on what's going on, as Skyler Thomas has done in his documentary and the videos that he makes, allows us to also shed light on the fallacies of a movement that these days is greenwashing ranching and portraying veganism as impossible or unsustainable. So to give a bit of a background on See the Commons, our focus is on food systems, on creating social change through the radical transformation of food systems. We want to help wrest food systems from corporate control, build just and sustainable alternatives. We are a vegan organization. We were, myself, the other founder, many, not all of our volunteers have been vegan, have been animal liberationists. However, we do not promote veganism as a solution really to anything other than just animal cruelty. So we're not trying to build a case against meat by saying, it's bad for social justice, because, well, you could build a case against many products in that way. So I won't get too much into this about the philosophy of how we do things, but just keep in mind that for us, it's not that we're promoting veganism as a solution, rather it's an ethic. In the same way that people don't eat cats or dogs, we don't eat cows. And so how do we build a just and sustainable food system with that as a paradigm, right? Now, our goal from a political, social perspective, environmental perspective is to promote agroecology. And as vegans, we promote vegan agroecology. So it's not that the veganism is the solution here. The veganism is the paradigm within which we promote the solution. Now, one of the issues that we've confronted over the years is this idea that that's just not a possibility, that if you want just and sustainable food systems, you have to include animals. And before, people now talk about regenerative grazing, but that was already an idea before, that you need the animals in the ecosystems, hence in the farming, and so on. And so our focus on this issue has been not because we're trying to find all the examples where the meat industry is going wrong, but rather we started out by saying, okay, let's understand what this impediment is to building a world in which our food systems are based on ecological farming that does not exploit animals. What we're hearing from the environmental movement, from the food movement, is that it's not possible to do that. And so we started exploring, where do these ideas come from? And so that's kind of how we came into this. Now, I want to so the grazing issue and the Point Reyes issue really should be understood in the context of a broader kind of PR push for ranching in particular and animal agriculture in general. Now, I wanted to say something about the title of this webinar, Cattle versus Nature, or Cattle v. Nature. It's not cows v. nature. Cows are animals. Animals belong in nature, of course. But cattle is a term that typically we use in the context of agriculture, and specifically in the context of commodification and property. So that's the aspect of it that I think we're seeing a conflict with nature throughout the world. Some of you may know that the film Kiss the Ground that many people speak about, the first name of it was supposed to be Kale versus Cow. And the name was sort of a tongue-in-cheek kind of making fun of vegans because they were saying, well, actually, we need both the kale and the cow. And vegans only want one, and therefore they don't understand complexity and so on. But here, what I want to show is that we're not really talking about cows. We're talking about cattle. We're talking about a specific system of property and commodification. And that is something that not only is in conflict with nature, contrary to what we're being told that this is fundamental to saving nature, but this is a conflict that is using the full force of the state, of the laws, to impose itself continuously on nature. So I'm going to just give a little brief background on the history as it relates to what's going on in Point Reyes. So cattle have not been in the Americas since forever. Farm animals came to North America with colonization. And so when I say that, I don't want people to think that that's the point, that anything that came with colonizers is necessarily bad. What's important to understand is that ranching in particular was not just a byproduct of European presence. It was actually a driver and a mechanism of colonization. And this is especially true in California, where the whole colonial project was organized around cattle ranching. And so that was how the land was largely used. The Spanish, the Mexicans, the Americans gave land that was empty, but we know it wasn't empty, of course, gave it to settlers so that settlers would stay. But mostly it was used for ranching, and ranching was also the mechanism by which both Native Americans were to be civilized through contact with livestock and, the domesticated animal and that sort of European ideal. And also the land itself was to be brought to its full potential. So a lot of these ideas were part of the ideology of manifest destiny, which justified Europeans moving west and colonizing the American West. Now, today in the United States, I think it's 41% of the land in continental United States or contiguous United States is used to feed livestock. That's a huge amount of land. If you just talk about just pasture in the United States is the largest use of land of any industry. So we have a country that is very much based on cattle farming. And the situation today, I think we can say, is the culmination of manifest destiny. And so one of the things that I really want people to get from today's webinar is that we don't have a past that maybe was unfortunate where we killed the bison, but that was the past. And then what do we do about it today? That's not the case. There's a continuum. There's no difference between the past and the present. Whatever you've heard about the history of ranching, colonization, and so on is still happening today to some extent in many places, for example, Point Reyes. So in Point Reyes, Skyler is going to talk about it, but we have dairy farmers who were basically given land and they should have left. They didn't. One of the issues here is a conflict with native wildlife. And this is important because a lot of the discourse that legitimizes this is we need animals in our ecosystem. Okay, sure. But why are we killing the animals in our ecosystem? But Point Reyes is not unique. Animals are everywhere in the Western United States where cattle is grazing. We hear often about the bison. In Yellowstone, bison are still killed every year to protect the profits of ranchers. But again, this is not only the United States. The American colonial history is not particularly unique. So I just want to give you a brief snapshot going south from here. So let's first look at Mexico. The other founder of See the Commons is from a town in central Mexico. That town was established as what they called the Republic of Indians, which maybe in the United States, a similar concept would be an Indian reservation. So he comes from a town that is traditionally a Republic of Indians. Now, at the same time, the economy outside of that town was based on ranching because that's the Spanish granted land grants to ranchers. So there's again this history where Native Americans have been made to work on the ranches. And over time, as the structures changed, that it was no longer a city, but a county, ranching became much more powerful politically, as we are seeing in Point Reyes. South of there, the Zapatistas, I think there's a very interesting thing in Chiapas that echoes this idea of empty land and civilizing the land and bringing land to its full productivity and its full potential. When the Zapatistas rebelled in 1994, they took over a lot of the land that belonged to the ranchers. Now, I read a really interesting book that was somewhat sympathetic to exploring the rancher perspective because everybody was focusing on the Zapatista perspective. And what the anthropologist was saying is that for a lot of ranchers, it wasn't so much their own personal loss of property that they found really tragic and painful, but rather what they found really tragic and painful was looking at land that had been devoting to ranching and seeing it resorted to just growing corn and beans and these things. And for them, when they saw that, what they saw was unproductive land. The land was not being used, and they thought that was a tragedy. So there's always this European ideal of bringing the land to its potential and productivity through cattle grazing. In Nicaragua, earlier this year, Oakland Institute, which is a nonprofit based in Oakland, Oakland Institute, they study land grabbing throughout the world. And they came out with a report just a few months ago showing that because of COVID, beef production had stalled in the United States. And so Americans were importing more beef from Nicaragua. And the effect of this was that ranchers in Nicaragua were moving more into indigenous lands. Indigenous people were being killed to supply beef for Americans. And I want to really point out the beef I'm talking about here in Nicaragua is not CAFO, it's not factory farm beef. This dichotomy has been created where only CAFOs are the problem. No, this is grass-fed beef. So this stuff that you hear about is not old history. This is not 300 years ago. This is 2020. In 2018, I wrote an article, A Call to Counter the False Solution of Regenerative Grazing. And last year, 2019, I happened to be speaking with someone from Nicaragua, a farmer activist. And I asked him, well, what do you think about these ideas about, do we need grazing and so on? He didn't know about my article. He didn't know that I had sort of taken their term false solution to apply it to grazing because the term came about in a different context. And this person said, oh, that just sounds like another false solution. I mean, ranchers have always had this conflict with the sedentary people. They kick us out of our lands, we move on, they kick us out some more, and they say we're the ones degrading the lands when it's in fact them. Now, Brazil has been in the news in the past couple of years. We used to hear more about the importance of the Amazon as lungs of the planet. I think now as we hear more about grasslands, we're kind of forgetting the importance of forests. But forests are very important, and as you raise forests, all the carbon that's stored in the trees just gets released into the air. So it's really terrible in many ways to raise the Amazon forest. And not only has that been going on over the past decades because of increasing beef consumption throughout the world, but in the past couple of years with Bolsonaro, environmental protections have been loosened. And so we're seeing more and more cattle ranching in Brazil, more burning of the forest to make way for grazing. Now, those lands are not empty. When you watch documentaries about what's going on in Brazil, it's the same story as Point Reyes. Basically, settlers, ranchers were given land grants. We're told you can go there because it's, again, empty, develop it, make it productive. And then when the world started being more environmentally aware, maybe in the 90s, about what was going on, they sought to start protecting the Amazon. And the ranchers got upset and said, no, we're entitled to this land. We were given this land. And so this is the story that repeats itself everywhere. I think there's a whole mystique, especially now, because so many of us are aware that we need to change our food systems, that we need to defend our food systems from Bayer and Syngenta and, all of these guys. It's true. So there's this idea that the rancher is the counter to that they're going to be the alternative. And there's a sort of mystique about the rancher being rooted in the land. But what I want to leave you with is that this is just a well-crafted image that isn't true. The rancher in America, in the Americas, is rooted in colonial history, and they feel entitled to the land. But they're not the only ones who work the land, and they're not necessarily the ones who know how to work it best. Now, the environmental movement is absolutely, well, not all of the environmental movement, certainly not. We've had speakers who are part of it and who were very critical of this, but much of the environmental movement, much of the local food movement in San Francisco is absolutely complicit with this. 2 years ago when we were organizing, 2 years ago, Seed the Commons organized the farmers contingent at the local climate march. It was the largest climate march on the West Coast. And we were putting forth farmers who use ecological methods, small scale, don't exploit animals. And at the same time, one of the programs that was going on was a program by which restaurants could give a portion of their profits to zero carbon programs. And one of the programs was, regenerative grazing in Marin County. And this is something that we're seeing more and more, that environmental organizations are very much pushing for this and adopting this uncritically, not understanding that they're being sort of taken in by industry PR. And I would say the vegan movement also has been pretty complicit in this. I could make a whole webinar out of this. If you guys are interested, just let me know. This is not the time to take away from Skyler Thomas's video. But one thing I will mention here is that within the vegan movement, a lot of people have really been seduced by this idea that we need to sort of have this model with the cows to regenerate the land. And so the Kiss the Ground Maker used to be a vegan. Sage restaurant in Los Angeles, it's a vegan restaurant. When you go there, a portion of what you pay gets donated to regenerative projects. This is all part of the same family that had Gracias Madre and the Café Gratitude restaurants. Dr. Broner is a vegan company that donates to animal stuff, but they also donate to regenerative projects. Seed the Commons actually has asked them for sponsorships for our forum multiple times. We've invited farmers like Helen Athow, regenerative farmers who are vegan, and they're not interested in funding that, but they do fund grazing projects. And in my interactions with people in the vegan movement, I found that there's very much this idea that, maybe what we should do is just use sanctuaries as a place to bring in animals to do regenerative grazing. But that's not a long-term solution if we don't want to have factory farms from which to rescue the animals. And so there's a real unwillingness to actually challenge the ideas themselves rather than legitimize them and say, well, we'll just do it in a sanctuary way instead of a for-profit way. Even one person that was very involved in this transformation thing that we were going to work with, we said, oh, this is great. We're going to be able to show the fallacies of the regenerative grazing movement. And she was saying, no, we don't want to do that because we want to apply their principles. So I think there's a lot to say there, but basically people have been pretty seduced by the idea that cows are necessary. And a lot of the discourse here is that they're necessary because we need animals in our ecosystem. So again, why is the situation in Point Reyes important? Because there are already animals in our ecosystem, and sometimes they're being killed to make way for cows. So if we want to really talk about the animals in our ecosystems and how they're necessary, I think it needs to be with more honesty about who is on the land already. All right, so I'm going to let Skyler continue.
This week, I literally just finished a mini series debunking regenerative ranching, and it touched on a lot of what you said. It's so funny, these people getting back in touch with nature are still excluding nature. You can have animals in this habitat as long as it's their commodity animals, none of the native animals. And this idea of setting up sanctuaries, I actually used a farm animal sanctuary as an example for how it doesn't work, because a handful of domesticated livestock just bring the land to its knees, and if we were to try and give all of these livestock sanctuary, you're essentially taking away more native habitat from the animals that actually already live there and work with that land. And you also touched on something great, this sense of entitlement and these people being connected with the land, and we just automatically give them that title. But if you look at the treatment of this land, when someone says they're a 5th and 6th generation rancher and therefore you should just listen to what they have to say, you look at their behavior and it's 5 and 6 generations of being disconnected from the earth. It's just exploitation. Right before I give the video, I just want to say that the revelations of how the Park Service is mismanaging Point Reyes are ongoing. So although I finished the first cut of this film in February of 2019, I've been continuing to document Point Reyes. and make more informative videos. And I'm working on recuts of the film. There's just so many problems coming out of there. And many of you are aware of the plight of the tule elk. The tule elk kind of are the spotlight animal helping get some attention. And you're aware of the ones that are trapped behind the fence in the reserve without access to adequate water or forage. So they're dying pretty nasty, long deaths. And along with another advocate, we took great pains this year to go out and document the reality of the situation out there. So between what I filmed and between a revealing conversation I had with Park Service staff out there, I can tell you that it's pretty bleak. It's pretty bad. And I have that entire series up on the web also if you want to go and check that out. Since all that's already up and you can go and look at it, I wanted today's presentation to be something unique for Seed the Commons. So I made something new, and I chose to focus on the shift of vegetation that's caused by ranching in the seashore and Marin County and California and the United States. Because this shift in the vegetation, shift in the native habitat, as you, Nassim, were kind of already saying, in turn affects all the other animals that were living there and using that habitat. And a massive percentage of this is not growing food to solve a hunger problem. It's being given to cattle, an incredibly inefficient way to create food for humans that arguably we shouldn't be eating in the first place. So I just finished that debunking video, which you can also find online. And with that intro, I'll just play the video. And I want to remind everyone that all the footage in this is taken in Point Reyes National Seashore. So examples of horrifying mismanagement of land and the effects of ranching. I didn't have to go and search for a factory farm or some particularly well-known abusive area. I went to a place that gets to have the title of being a model for how to do it correctly. And that alone is enough to raise an alarm.
This presentation is for the webinar called Wildlife versus Cattle. And really, that means nature versus cattle, because you can't wage war on a member of a habitat without the rest of the habitat being affected. This is not a monoculture. This is nature, where the members of the habitat all need each other and work together. The tule elk are front and center in this because they are an iconic species. They are endemic to California, so we could also call this elk versus cattle. But it's much more than elk versus cattle, because if this is how the Park Service is going to manage a species in the spotlight, it should sound an alarm for other species. Now, many of us, myself included, remember a morning, a special day in Point Reyes, shrouded in fog. And unfortunately, that special morning was followed by looking at this, looking at this, and maybe the worst for me was looking at this. And that's when I dropped everything that I was doing to work on this project, because it just was too much for me to believe that everything good I had experienced was being destroyed for something that I found to be rather horrific. The exploitation of the livestock is something that bothers me, but the treatment of the land is a tragedy in itself. And, as I already hinted on, you can't mistreat the land without mistreating all the animals that depended on that land, or at least that land in the form that it was before the exploitation began. I'm just going to let the footage play for a little bit as you wrap your head around the fact that this is a national seashore, a unique location cherished as an epicenter for biodiversity, reduced to this. Almost every challenge facing water quality, facing the soil, facing the plants, facing the wildlife, would be solved by simply ending ranching. But all of those problems are justified by culture and tradition. Economics is thrown in there too, but that's a lie for another video. Let's focus on plant ecology for a minute. This is Point Reyes, September 13th, 2020. this is also Point Reyes, the very same day. Except this is in the elk reserve, free of ranching activity. And there isn't any incredible geographic change. There isn't a mountain separating the two areas. There's just a fence. And right now I'm panning from the elk reserve to ranch land. And I'm going to point something out here. As drastic as that change is, that's land not actively being ranched. That's land that's recovering from ranching. This is me standing inside the elk reserve looking back out at land that is actively being ranched. Maybe you're thinking, that's not fair. You got to show it during the winter when it's rainy. Okay, well, there you go. This is ranch land, January of 2020. So yeah, there's some green, even where there shouldn't be green. And this is the elk reserve, also January of 2020. Ranch land, later in the spring. And the elk reserve, later in the spring. Point being, that was as good and as green as the ranch land gets. But during September, during the harsher months, even the elk reserve, where native plants are allowed to live, you can still find green. These are plants that are drought resistant because they evolved in the climate of California with animals that evolved with those plants. And while it's true that the hills do turn green in the winter in the ranchland, that is not habitat. That is essentially a golf course void of biodiversity. And it's not just some coincidence that vegetation that provides habitat for animals is missing from ranchland. No, it was removed by and for that industry. And that reduction, unfortunately, is ongoing. Fire control and vegetation management is a topic increasingly on everyone's minds, so I've got to touch on this really quick. A promotional spin on behalf of the ranchers is that they are actually fighting back invasive brush, and in so doing are keeping the seashore recreationally accessible. There I am, struggling through the invasive brush, which, by the way, is actually native brush. Gee, can't wait to get back to that ranch land for my beautiful hike in nature. And no animal agriculture propaganda would be complete without the argument that we need grazing cattle to reduce the threat of fire. Keep that in mind as you learn about the plants in Point Reyes. Unfortunately, when you look out over the coyote brush, and I'm just going to stop the video right there for a minute because you can see that not everything is green. You have some perennial plants that change color a little bit, some are even a little bit red. The reason I'm showing you this is everything you see, well, almost everything, like 99% of what you see that is not green or looks like it's potential fire fuel is not native. It's introduced, it's annual, and can be traced back to animal agriculture. Point being, there is no magic preventing these invasive plants that are intentionally planted within the seashore from spreading outside of ranch boundaries. So rather than decades of inspirational recovery, we have a seashore where invasive plants actually have a stronghold, and a park service spending more resources on defending ranching within the seashore than on restoring native flora and fauna. The footage I've been showing you is actually within the elk reserve. Let's take a closer look at some of these plants. And I'm going to start with some native plants, some rushes, bunch grasses, and show you that you can't uproot them. They have nice, deep, strong roots. They have a root system capable of carbon sequestration. Now, let's take some of these invasive plants and rip them up, and you can see the extent of their root system. Let's count the non-native fire fuel. Here we have bull thistle, and there is a lot of bristly dogtail grass all over the elk reserve. There's a lot of common velvet grass all over the elk reserve also. And there are several different bromes out there. You just can't escape those in California anymore. And even if you aren't concerned for the habitat, you should be concerned for your dogs, because those are bad for your dogs. I'm just going to pan up really quick and show you the elk so everyone knows that I really am in the elk reserve. Let's move from the elk reserve into the beautiful official ranch land. As pro ranchers like to say, Point Reyes is a model for how wildlife and ranching can coexist. Now I'm just picking up invasive fire fuel at the edge of a field and stating that that's what you'll find growing out there. I don't know if these are mowings from the harvest or if some of the hay that was brought in was spilled. Then we got slender oats, another introduced agricultural invasive fire fuel. There I am breaking apart more bull thistle, also fire fuel. And even more brome. Bromes and cheat grasses and oats start to look the same to me. I'm not 100% sure what all of them are, but I know they don't belong here, and I know that they all turn into fire fuel. Some parts of the grazing land have been so abused that not even the invasives are growing there. It just looks like sand. It makes me very sad to look at this and think of the native vegetation that was once there and the animals that lived in it. Now, will anything ever grow here? Can you force anything? Sure. Bring in your trucks full of seeds, plant it with plants that don't belong there, cover that with manure, and get some more manure, then get some liquefied manure, and then spread that manure. Just keep spreading manure from your never-ending supply of manure to make plants grow that are never supposed to have grown there, and then call it nature. And this, by the way, is the root system of the end product of all that manure. There's your carbon storage. Doesn't compare to the root system of a true native plant, but the ranchers either bulldoze those or the cattle kill them. When the non-native vegetation grows, it presents another problem, because animals need habitat, and animals are going to seek habitat, even if their options have been reduced to fields of annual agricultural crops. This brings us to the horror of the annual silage mowing. Multiple studies presented to the Park Service have confirmed the negative effects that this activity has on bird populations. Not just the destruction of the nests, but the literal chopping up of animals, as well as the promotion of other species that inhibit other species. And yet, after decades, nothing has changed. And I witnessed for myself animals falling victim to mower blades within Point Reyes National Seashore. As for larger species, the tule elk trapped behind the elk fence are allowed to die because the Park Service doesn't want their populations to exceed a certain number. As for the elk living on the other side of the fence, the Park Service plans to manage their populations lethally at the behest of ranchers who don't like the elk eating any of the vegetation on the ranch lands. Once again, the justification for this is the preservation of beef and dairy businesses operating within the seashore, which finally brings me to the real point. Everything you've been looking at out here, all of that land, thousands of acres, hundreds of miles of barbed wire, the seeding, the planting, the compost, the irrigation, the grazing, the silage fields, the erosion, the soil compaction, the water pollution, the competition against native wildlife. None of this is being done for the sake of growing food for humans. One of the emotional arguments presented to defend the ranchers is that they are providing food for the American people, but they're providing food for cows. And even after everything I showed you, that's still not enough. They still have to import supplemental feed for these cattle. It's the most unsustainable use of land for food production that you can imagine, while also negatively impacting everything that was trying to live there before that land was damaged. I don't even have to go into the health debate of the consumption of meat and dairy. If the actual goal was to feed people, a tiny fraction of that land could be dedicated to growing crops that human beings could eat directly. But we don't even need that tiny fraction of land in the seashore to grow crops to feed human beings. We don't need that land to grow cattle, even if we insist on continuing to eat meat and dairy. The rest of Marin County has got it covered. If you recall from earlier in the video, the introduced plants, the annual agricultural plants, causing a shift from green perennial to yellow and dead annual within the seashore. Well, start paying attention as you drive through Marin County, especially in the summer and fall months. It's not green. It's not perennial. It's not native habitat. It is absolutely dominated by ranch land that has reduced California's biodiversity to grazing fields filled with the annual fire fuel plants that animal agriculture introduced to California. Trampled land, giant barns, stock ponds or manure ponds, and a few trees that remain. It goes from tree to nothing. Do you really think that that is California's ecological heritage? Trees and then nothing? No brush, no other perennial plants, just trees, and then fields of golden plants that magically match plants that came over from Europe. This devastated land is the result of dedicating that land to the use of cattle. There are no orchards here. There are no fruit trees. There are no vegetables. This is all grazing land. Go ahead, count all the wildlife that you see in this wonderful open space as it's promoted to be. And you find the same horrors that you find in Point Reyes throughout the rest of Marin County. Those are the same sad isolation cages for newborn calves, just like I gave you a close-up of earlier in the video. Except here there's 75 of them. 75 new babies taken from their mothers for the sake of the ongoing dairy industry that turns land into that. This is the proud tradition, the culture that must be preserved in Point Reyes National Seashore, even though it dominates Marin, Sonoma counties, most of California, most of the United States. Loss of healthy ecosystems, loss of biodiversity, degraded soil, and polluted water, all for the insistence of pursuing something that we should have abandoned a long time ago. Oh, and as far as supporting your struggling local farmer, wait until you find out what % of land in Marin County is owned by the same families.
That was really an amazing video. Thank you so much for sharing that. I have a couple comments, and maybe I'll do one or two questions, and people can also add questions to the Q&A section. Please use the Q&A button because it's just easier to follow and instead of sifting through the discussion. So before we get more into the issues in Point Reyes, I actually want to acknowledge, so, Skyler in his video says, well, this is what's being promoted as the good way of doing things. And I think that that's both true and not true in terms of who's saying these things. So I think for many people, that is the case. They're saying this is organic, it's grass-fed, it's not factory farm. And so I want to come back to this, but I also want to acknowledge that for many proponents, or at least I'm anticipating that for sort of the proponents who are really involved in actual sort of regenerative grazing, that they would look at this and say, well, this isn't what we're talking about, and this is not done well, and this is not the model that we're proposing. And I actually remember at some point I'd posted something I'd written about Point Reyes and grazing to Facebook, and and one of the pro-grazing people had written that, sympathetically was saying like, yeah, what's happening there is really a shame and that shouldn't be happening. So I want to acknowledge that some of the discourse we get from, especially as a consumer, if you're going to Whole Foods, you're hearing grass-fed, grass-fed. And so it's very important to see what that looks like in Point Reyes. But there's also a much more kind of strict and specific idea of rotational grazing, so on and so forth. And so people might say, well, Skyler and Nassim and so on, you guys are not being fair because this is not the model that we're actually talking about. And when people are, raising the Amazon and then degrading the soil by keeping all their cows there forever and ever, and then degrading it and moving on, that's not what we're talking about. That's not regenerative grazing. All right. Having acknowledged that, the problem with that is that the message is being used by the people in Point Reyes and elsewhere, even if they're not actually applying Alan Savory's techniques and so on and so forth, they're using this narrative to market their products and to justify their presence. And so that's something that we need to understand, and that the movement, if it wants to be serious, should really be more specific and say, okay, we're not talking about Point Reyes, and we're not talking about Yellowstone, and we're not talking about Brazil. And then we could have, I think, a much more constructive discussion about what the model really is and where they propose that it be applied. Because as it stands now, even if you would say that what's happening in Point Reyes is not truly regenerative grazing and so on, because of the popularity of that idea, it's being used in the marketing. The same sound bites are being used. So for example, Albert Strauss, who is the founder, the CEO of the Strauss Organic Dairy Company, in the context of this fight between dairy farmers and conservationists in Point Reyes, had written an article in OPED saying this is really a shame because the dairy farming in Point Reyes can help with carbon sequestration and we need the dairy farmers and so on. And so whether or not they're actually applying the models as they should be applied, they are using the sound bites to market their products and to legitimize their presence. And the public is absolutely, totally buying it. I mean, in the Bay Area, these are companies that are very celebrated and that are seen as very much stewards of the land. If you look at Brazil, like we have this dichotomy between the CAFOs, the factory farms, and then the non-factory farms. But Brazil is the largest exporter of beef in the world, and it's just been exporting more and more because the world is eating more beef. Maybe not last year and this year, but the world is eating more beef, and that's not CAFO beef. So I think that we need to keep that in mind and realize that it's not just that we have two models here. We have more than that, and a lot of the problems we're talking about are not about CAFOs. So, Skyler, you mentioned how much of the land is owned by the same people. I'm very curious to know that. I think that that's kind of in the same way that this dichotomy between the grass-fed and the CAFO has been put forth. What we're forgetting is that it's not just large corporations like Syngenta or Bayer that have power. It's also people who have been granted land, whose families were granted land generations ago and who've held on to that land. They're also very powerful economically and politically. So I wanted to ask if you could talk a bit about that, and also about kind of the political aspect of this fight. Like why are these people there despite the activism and all the work that's being done to protect the elk?
Okay. The amount of acreage in Marin County and the family lineage gets pretty complicated. That's kind of like a documentary within itself. Figure that I've been working on with someone else is that over 80% of the ranches on the Point Reyes National Seashore Peninsula, 13 of 16, are leased to 4 families whose collective land holdings in Marin County total over 24,000 acres. And most of the ranching in Point Reyes is leased by those same families. So it's not a case, and this was one of the first arguments that I came up against when I made my film was, well, how dare you pick on these small struggling ranchers? And the realization is that they have more land and more money than I can dream of having in several lifetimes.
Yeah.
And really, even if it was a small struggling family, I don't understand why we're so quick to bend over backwards and turn a blind eye to something that's wrong. It's not being done right. Animals are being abused. The land is being abused. And even if they weren't actually quite wealthy and powerful, it doesn't make it still not incorrect. But the money and the power come along with how this is continuing to happen, rather than actually phasing out, which is the original intention for Point Reyes National Seashore. And you can read this for yourself in the administrative history of Point Reyes National Seashore. Instead, money was spent on lobbying, money was spent going to Congress and testifying. Amendments to the original legislation have been made and attempted to try and change the wording to make it sound like the culture of ranching was an integral part of preserving the seashore. So, and in a really revealing comment in my interview with Seashore staff, she accidentally, in her attempt to defend their alternative plan B, stated that when they try to crack down on the ranchers, politicians actually step in and intervene on their behalf. So there's a lot of power there. There's a lot of influence there by very rich, powerful families with a very long history in Marin County. And there was also an article that just came out last week showing that Jared Huffman actually receives more donations from agribusiness for his campaign than from environmental organizations. And compounding that further is that, unfortunately, quite a few of these environmental organizations, that we call conservative, are comprised of ranchers, and boards are comprised of ranchers. So here you have people that we look to as being the good guys who are sending a bad message out to the public saying, well, look, we think that ranching is good for the environment, so you should listen to us. And they're in a position of influence.
So Liz is asking, are there any attorneys attempting to stop this?
There are some organizations pursuing a lawsuit. They have to wait until official decisions have been made, and there are a lot of mini decisions and hearings that are made before that official decision. So I guess they can't launch the lawsuits until official decisions have been made. But there are definitely people working on this issue.
All right, so Norma is a member of the California Native Plant Society, and she says that even members of the CNPS seem stuck on cattle as the only realistic solution to minimizing fire hazards in parks. I know how Native peoples burn small patches lightly, which is not how the agencies are using fire, to my knowledge. Any thoughts? Specifically, if the cattle are removed, weeds will spring back and take over since they outgrow natives?
I did an entire another documentary on urban grazing, the myth of urban grazing. My eyes for a lot of things that our eyes are closed to were opened up because of Point Reyes National Seashore. What was happening there made me start looking at California. And where you see urban grazing taking place, and unfortunately it's increasing, are the same locations where you see a problem with the spread of these invasive plants. And these are prime kindling for fire. Trees and forests get a bad rap, but the reality is that they're quite capable of resisting fire and often survive fires, except for the dramatic fires that we're having now, which are happening as a result of drought and climate change and suppression of natural fires. So when the fires do happen, they turn into these infernos. But a lot of the kindling for that can be traced back to these weeds and these invasive plants. So to address that question, how can you really say that the solution to the problem is the source of the original problem? Grazing does not get rid of invasive plants. It may shorten them temporarily, but it also is simultaneously reseeding those plants and spreading them into further areas. Secondly, I tried really hard in that video to show the reality of native perennial plants if they aren't hindered by invasive plants. And you can see that those are going to be more fire resistant. Now you have, let's take the elk reserve, for example, and you have an elk reserve that has started to get choked out by invasive plants. Those invasive plants are going to provide the fire kindling that might actually burn plants that would otherwise be resistant to those fires. It was human intervention on the land that caused that shift in balance. So it is not unreasonable to expect human interference to set things right. If we have to go in and remove those plants, not set animals grazing upon those plants, because that does not solve the problem. There are several papers written proving this, even though those aren't the ones that people hear about because they aren't being promoted by animal agriculture. And George Werthner spoke on this in your last webinar and sent me several papers on it. But how about if our Park Service, rather than defending ranching and allowing invasive annual fire fuel to be seeded in the seashore, we're spending resources going out and getting rid of the invasive plants? That would be an interesting study to see how fire resistant native land can actually be once it's returned to its natural state. And I'm not saying fire shouldn't ever happen. Fire does happen. Fire is a part of nature. Humans just find it really inconvenient. And in our attempts to subdue something inconvenient, we've made the problem worse. But if you really want to get back to nature, or at least a form of nature, then again, let's bring in the Miwok and have them do some controlled burns and let the animals and the native animals do grazing. Why is it always domestic livestock that gets the opportunity to go in and graze in an area where we really should be focused on returning animals that have disappeared or are threatened? I find it really offensive that we human beings have reduced the biomass of wild mammals to 4%. Livestock are at 60%. And we're talking about that we need more livestock and should be unleashing livestock into wild habitat with what little is left. It's just ridiculous.
I mean, yeah, like the biggest land use in the US is cattle. And you have people today who are saying, you know, in environmental circles, we need more cows in the rangelands. And this is just a continuation of this idea of we're going to civilize these lands with our cows. There's a book on the colonization of California through cattle that points out that not only the role that ranches played in this sort of civilizing process, but also the in the British view, there was a hierarchy between domesticated animals who are like subjected to man's dominion and wild animals. And so domesticated animals were much more valuable and seemed more civilized and so on. Continuing on what you were saying right now, Melissa Hoffman asked a bit more along the same lines. Are there studies and data out there to show relative carbon sequestration and life systems benefit of not introducing cows to a landscape like this? Seems people like Paul Hawken would be interested in showing how native ecology competes with climate benefits, et cetera. I'm wondering if there's a way to make the argument on the same terms, i.e. carbon, and then of course habitat, insects, birds, et cetera.
They do exist. You just unfortunately don't hear about them. In fact, when I search for them, you have to get through pages of the studies that have been funded by Animal Ag promoting all this stuff. I mean, it's just really blown up, this greenwashing. But the studies do exist. And unfortunately, the greenwashing is taking place in universities. You know, I asked George Werthner after your last webinar, I said, are there going to be more people like you coming out of our schools, or are there going to be more people that are seeing cattle as the future? We could go on forever on that. Let's just focus on Point Reyes National Seashore. Wouldn't it be nice in a national seashore that part of the mandate says is for scientific purposes, for inspiration, for restoration, for preservation, for scientific purposes, for education? Wouldn't it be great if they were conducting that out there and finding out how the native wildlife and the native plants are contributing positively to the environment, to climate change, instead of spending all this time trying to convince us that putting in another poop pond to store even more poop on top of the saturation of poop out there really isn't bad after all, if you look into the fine print of our BS article. You know, how about the tule elk? How about the fact that this iconic species is going to be managed lethally because the ranchers say it's a problem? Where is the science provided by the seashore staff? You know, before you go and kill a native animal, maybe a study that proves that these claims are true. You know, the fact that they, and ranching has taken place out there before this was turned into a seashore. So you have more than since the 60s that cattle have been overgrazing that land and diminishing that land. But now we're going to blame the elk for eating too much grass in that ranch land. And these people who have land holdings outside of the seashore, and some of them have ventured into multiple businesses, are going to say that their bottom line, their financial stability is being threatened by some beautiful, wonderful wildlife grazing on grass in the seashore. That's ridiculous enough. But how about if our Park Service staff conducted a study that actually proved that damage before just saying, yeah, we're going to go ahead and kill those animals? There is an incredible lack of science taking place out there. Judd Howell, who has a PhD in wildlife biology and actually worked for the Park Service conducting a study on tule elk in the reserve, said this to me in my interview with him. Ask the Park Service to provide their science. Where are their peer-reviewed papers, particularly for the elk in the elk reserve? Because the Park Service tell everyone that the elk are fine, that there's enough water out there. Where is your study showing that everything's fine? I asked the park, you tell everyone that there's enough water. How much water does an adult tule elk need to drink per day? They didn't know. They didn't know. How is that possible? This is one of the few locations in the world where these animals are available to conduct a study of that kind, and our own Park Service doesn't know that simple answer, at the same time that they are happy to tell everyone that the elk have plenty of water as they're dying. Dave Press, their ecologist on the range, literally finished the last die-off with a quote in the articles from 2015 saying, this is a great research opportunity. And yet no research took place. No research took place. You know, half the herd died, but let's not look into a solution if it happens again.
So a question from Arnold. Given the money and power involved and the stance of local politicians, does the appointment of Deb Haaland offer hope of change? How do we get the National Park Service to change, or are the new leases locked in place for future generations?
The leases aren't locked in place yet, but you know, it's I've seen so much just blatant corruption. You know, you go to agencies and you show this overwhelming evidence and overwhelming evidence. You know, these are violations of NEPA. You know, they're not preserving this national seashore to the full extent as is required. and it just doesn't matter, it seems like. And, you know, I just got word today that the California Coastal Commission ignored data provided to them. I don't know if that's official yet, but I got wind of that. So that's just another organization. Everybody's afraid, whether it's the power or if you're seen as being offensive to say anything against animal agriculture and ranching. You know, and I encountered this at first too. And, you know, and it's interesting, all these people who are suddenly sympathetic toward ranchers. Well, I'd like to ask them, what other organizations and what other plights out there are you behind, you know, that you're fighting to help? Or are you only interested in helping people who damage the land as a living, hurt animals for a living, and who receive billions of dollars in subsidies for the government to produce an unsustainable product? Are those the only ones that you get sad about and want to make sure you defend? Because I had to leave teaching because it's unsustainable. I don't hear anyone picking up a charity plate for me because I'm not, you know, hurting animals and killing wildlife and destroying the land.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, good point. I think you've already spoken a bit about this. I'll just ask you this question if you want to add anything. If California is so adamant about monitoring water usage, why are the government structures propping up frameworks, animal farming that harm ecology when animal farming wastes so much resources, including water?
Exactly. You know, it's all BS. It's wagging the dog. It's getting you to look other directions. You know, there's signs all over Inverness and Inverness Station and Point Reyes Station right now saying conserve water, you know, reduce your water usage. You know, that sounds great, but maybe you could stop blindly defending the industry that is sucking the land dry of water to give cattle 30 gallons of water per day. Adding insult to injury with the situation with the drought out there and the elk dying, ranchers are now pumping water out of the waterways near Abbott's Lagoon and Kehoe Creek for their personal resources. So even in areas of the park where wildlife did have water, now even that is being taken away for commercial operations. You know, when does it end? This is the National Seashore, a tiny little section of land in a country that is dominated by animal agriculture. And we're claiming that we can't even give that to the wildlife. If we can't prioritize wildlife there, I think it is a pretty bad indicator for what wildlife are facing everywhere. Just listen to this list of things that would be solved by simply removing ranching. The increased sediment in the streams due to erosion from cattle trampling it. And for some reason, they love to defecate in the streams and in the ponds. So the E. coli levels directly applied to the ponds, as well as the runoff coming onto land, have changed every body of water out there. You would end the removal and degradation of wild habitat. You would end the cruel. I know a lot of people are disconnected about where their food comes from, and you think it comes from Point Reyes National Seashore, that means everything's fine. Well, if you think taking a baby away from its mom shortly after birth and putting it in isolation, no touch with any other living being, is great, and then the mother that didn't get to have a baby but gets to have a baby again and again and again, give birth to one but never actually raise one, and then be killed when her body finally gives out at like 5-6 years of age and sent to slaughter, if you think that that's, you know, great and nice, wonderful. But in any case, you could end that. The intentional killing of wildlife, even taking place in the National Seashore, Wildlife Services, a department of our government under the Department of Agriculture, kills millions of native animals per year, almost exclusively for ranching. Get rid of native animals to make way for our domesticated animals. So you're talking about losing our biodiversity for one industry that we don't need. Lack of carbon sequestration due to the repetitive growing of annual plants that have replaced plants that are actually capable of carbon sequestration, as well as the habitat that those important native plants provided for a myriad of animals, from insects to birds to badgers, anything else that wants to use the plants. Promotion of non-native invasive plants through the intentional planting, consumption of the natural water sources that are redirected for the livestock, the release of carbon that was stored by removing the native vegetation, fence entanglements from the wildlife, habitat fragmentation due to the fencing. And then you have the money, you have the upkeep of the fences, you have the upkeep and the management of these poop ponds, upkeep of these barns, these massive barns and facilities. You have the slaughter of birds, literal chopping up of birds and other animals during harvest. You have the importation costs of the supplemental food for the cows. You have grants given by the state. I think it was last year, 15 ranches got $750,000 to pursue carbon solutions. The pursuit of multi-million-dollar methane digesters, billions in bailout subsidies annually. All of this effort, all this money, all these resources to keep something going that we could just move on from. And all of that, what's really upsetting is that the justification to keep doing something that, in my opinion, is pretty blatantly wrong is because my daddy did it. You know, 5th, 6th, 7th generation ranching tradition. You know, there's a lot of traditions throughout the history of humanity that needed to be abandoned, and this is one of them.
That's so George Worthner, if people got the webinar with him, he's the ecologist who also works on these issues in the Western United States. That's something that he's you know, pointed to, this historical argument. In Point Reyes, you have these like cute little signs that are like, oh, this was established in this year and it's supposed to be all authentic and quaint. And George Worthner wrote an article saying, well, but we've had a lot of historical uses in our parks. We've had, you know, mining and logging, and, you know, we've had all these problematic things. Why would that be an argument? Some histories are not to be preserved. So yeah, I think that we just need to stop being so seduced by this. And in terms of grants, like, again, I think it's really important to, I think it's really important, at least for us, for See the Commons, to hold the environmental movement accountable for falling so completely for what is just PR. I mean, as I said already, but for me, it was very shocking that while San Francisco, while the grassroots organizations here are organizing a climate march, and, you know, you have all these different groups, you know, who grassroots organizations and so on, putting in all this work. And in our case, we're bringing in farmers from around North America who really have a way of doing things that uses very little land, uses very little resources, is truly regenerative, and so on. They're using an opportunity like this to give more money to local ranching when local ranching is so incredibly problematic, ecologically, but also in terms of its history and its current politics in the Bay Area. And so that's what's going on. And I think that, again, you know, the environmental movement needs to be held accountable as to why they're being so supportive of this. There are a lot of good questions. So this is a question that was in regards to, wait, where did the question go? Wait a second. Wait a second. Did someone already answer this question? Well, okay. So, sorry. So this is the question in regards to the fact that what is going on in Point Reyes is not really necessarily what people are advocating for. So, so Jorge is asking Skyler, how about asking Mr. Savory, or I think this could go for other, you know, very well-known proponents of regenerative grazing. How about asking Mr. Savory for his endorsement or lack of endorsement of the use of holistic management, of the holistic management narrative by the Point Reyes ranchers? Yeah, that could be an interesting strategy, I think, to kind of put a spotlight on what is or isn't happening. So he's asking, what would you think of, yeah.
I mean, sure, if you have Mr. Savory's number, but I'm not actually, I'm not a big fan. I think I'm not a fan of Savory. I actually did a video about him. So it's another case of replace wild animals with.
Right. No, I don't. I think that the question there came from the comment about how I think a lot of people would say, well, what's going on in Point Reyes is not actually what we're advocating for. So I think it would be interesting for the local community, not necessarily Alan Savory, but for the local pro-grazing community to take a stance on Point Reyes, and if that's not what they're actually advocating for, maybe say it clearly or be put on the spot in any case.
Well, what are they advocating for? And who are the ranchers in Marin County that aren't tied to this family lineage? I would actually like to know that. I've often asked, because the ranchers in Point Reyes get so many breaks financially, I often wonder what other ranchers in Marin County think about that. I would guess that just like other locals, they don't really like to make a fuss.
So actually somebody had asked the question of, can you tell us who the families are? Is that something that you would want to go more into detail about?
I don't think today is great for that, but I will. I'm planning on it.
So one of the questions is the last comment by Skyler, so in your video, was he suggesting not to patronize farmers markets?
I don't know what comment that would be tied to. I'm
not totally sure either. Yeah, okay.
We can find a flaw in just about anything. And I'm not sure if that means that like I was in some way saying that farmers markets are bad. I'm sure there are bad things that happen in a lot of places, and a lot of people use that mentality not to pursue solutions. It's like, well, that's not perfect, so I'm going to keep doing this thing that's really, really bad. You have to be striving to improve, and we'll find a better solution down the road. We'll find it somewhere. A wildlife advocate that I used to work with, didn't really like that I was pointing, fingers at the Point Reyes ranching, and said, well, look, those cherries that you're eating, caused some environmental damage somewhere. Yeah, because humans think the planet belongs to them and that we get to use all of it to raise our own food. I don't know what type of campaign would ever be successful to tell humans we need to go back to foraging. I'm guessing that won't ever be a successful campaign. That doesn't mean that you just turn around and keep going with the worst thing that you could possibly be doing. I mean, the acreage used for cows, just dedicated to a single cow, is insane. Use a fraction of that acreage. And I understand that's not habitat either. An orchard, anything like that, that's also not habitat. That is for commercial use. That is for making a profit. And it, once again, is competition against nature, against other animals that might want to go in there and get a few bites for themselves. Yeah, that's not great. But if you're going to have something bad, you could have it at a fraction of the size and the damage and the cost of what animal agriculture causes.
So often I've heard that people say that it's not really ideal to just leave lands be rewilded. I know that for a lot of people that just sounds like it's so not common sense, but that is an argument I hear very often, that rewilding is not the ideal thing and that we need to be these sorts of stewards and like help restore. But your videos show that that's really not the case at all, right?
Well, I could answer that on two levels. In some cases, passive regeneration does work. The nature can take care of itself. Sometimes it does need a helping hand, and that's usually because we've abused it so badly. And when and where that's appropriate, I guess would be a case-by-case study. But Laura Cunningham, the ecologist and paleontologist that you saw in my video, shared an example of land where cattle were removed and the land naturally recovered. But you also, animals that work in that habitat are an important part of reviving that habitat. So if you remove the cattle, there is an argument to be made that you do need something there. You do need some sort of a ruminant there. And then you're going to need predators to manage those ruminants. That's nature. That's wild. And that's wonderful. It makes me sad that so many humans look at land and think that it doesn't have value unless we're monetizing it. It does have value, and it is being used. It's being used by wonderful creatures on this planet that enrich our experience being here on this earth. And we should give that land back to those animals. We can still enjoy it. We can still be there and be amongst it. We don't have to exploit it and rape it for it to have value.
Yeah, just one or two more questions, if that's okay with you. Please clarify if there, from Joyce, please clarify if there is a current NEPA Environmental Policy Act process going on with Point Reyes. If so, where in the process are they?
So the environmental assessment that was conducted as part of the new general management plans, NEPA is in place. So it's supposed to be in accordance with that. The management plans were actually written by and the assessment managed by a very shady company, which this article, I should send you the link. People really need to read it. That was done by Peter Brin, called Apocalypse Cow. This is in violation of NEPA, but the Park Service has been managing the seashore in violation of NEPA since the creation of the seashore, you could argue. So how do you hold them accountable for that is the issue that we're facing. And lawsuits are one way, and getting new leadership in our government to do the right thing is the other way. And public outrage, what's happening and has happened in Point Reyes has largely taken place because no one's been opposing it, at least not on a large scale. It is like one of the best kept secrets in California. When people find out about it, usually their jaws drop. You have a percentage of people who are rancher sympathizers who go that direction, but the vast majority are people like, how can this be? And well, the reason it can be is because you don't know about it and no one's saying anything about it. We're trying to change that, but you need to make your voices heard. Don't be polite, don't be quiet. Silence is complicit. You've got to speak out for your national seashore.
So actually, this leads me to what I wanted to ask you next. What is your hope in terms of the work that you're doing? Like how, in an ideal situation, how do you envisage that you making videos is going to play out and influence this situation?
It's a good question. And sometimes it's really discouraging. I've made shark documentaries before I ever did this, and a lot of it just doesn't seem to matter, no matter how horrific the story is. But Point Reyes National Seashore was just supposed to be a quick passion project. And I put it out, and it actually got attention. And it actually started being shown at film festivals, and it actually made a lot of people aware. And I find that highly encouraging. Some of the organizations and groups that I'm affiliated with now, I think at least in part, were sparked by seeing it. So I guess there is encouragement to keep doing that. But you have to not just look at the video and say, oh, that's a shame. You also need to participate in the movement. You need your voice to be heard. You can start your own grassroots campaign. You can make a movement within your community, especially the locals. The locals' voices have been drowned out. The public comment period showed clearly that the public does not want what the seashore is planning, what the Park Service is intending to do to the seashore. It clearly shows that they are simply catering to the desires of the ranchers. But unless these people, it seems to me, unless these people who oppose it are adamant about it and outraged about it and publicly upset about it and continue to fight against it, we'll just continue down the same path that we've been on. Do
you think that if we get enough boots on the ground, so to speak, at a local level that we will be able to reverse this and protect Point Reyes just for its wildlife? Like, is that sort of a realistic outcome?
There are some good things happening. There are some things that give some encouragement. And one element of that is not allowing Jared Huffman or other politicians to get away with the line that they've been giving to the public, saying, well, I'm doing what the people want. It's not true. It's not true. He's doing what the ranchers want. That's it. And this has been revealed with the public comment period. But the powers that be have the opportunity to just dismiss that and say, well, we don't think that's true. It's like the handling of the Trump administration on any science that you throw at them. We're like, nah, don't like your study. We're just going to toss it out. So you have to rise up in the community and make it clear that Huffman is wrong, and it's not what the locals want. You can't just sit in your living room and say, yeah, that's not what I want. And it can't be as comfortable for them as it has been in the past. This has been smooth sailing, getting whatever they want, to the point where they're bold enough to say, we want these wonderful elk that the public like to be killed, and that was a straw too far in the greed, because it actually woke people up.
All right, so it's already 11:30. I think we're going to wrap it up. I wanted, first of all, if Chama can share some links. So, if you guys can support Skyler. You can make a donation. You can also learn more. He has a lot of information, a lot of videos on his website. So I'm going to ask Chema to share that in the chat. So there are some links, Shame of Point Reyes. Also, if you like these webinars, please also see the comments. We also have a link for ourselves. And Skyler, I wanted to ask you before we leave, are there any, any last thoughts, any comments, any requests to local or non-local activists?
If I have a contact form on my website if you want to get in touch with me with being involved personally. There's so much content and so much going on out there that by the time I publish it, I fail to promote a lot of it. But if you go on my website, you'll find everything from series debunking, the usual propaganda and lies that you will encounter in the seashore when you start looking into this yourself, to original documentation. If you want to see the documentation for itself, I provided it to you on my website. And I have campaigns that you can get involved in. Spend a little time perusing the website. Warning, a couple of my videos, I take on my angry ecologist persona. So get past cursing in one or two of the videos, but most of them are pretty to sticking to it professionally. And there's a lot of guest scientists that I've interviewed on there, so you can hear from them too. It's not, I'm not making this stuff up. This isn't just something I decided to do on a whim one day. This is all backed up with researching the seashore. And if you want to take action, I do have links on the website under Take Action of who you can follow and petitions you can sign, which I need to update. But if you feel like you fell short finding something, send me a message. I'll help you.
So I just also want to say, for people who are not on Zoom, Skyler's website is shameofpointreyes.org. So just the name of his documentary, shameofpointreyes.org. And we'll also add that to the Facebook, and in our next newsletter, we'll send out all of those links as well.
I saw a message from Norma pop up saying that something about needing volunteers, and yes, I do. If you're one and you have some, send them to me.
Yeah, I'll actually copy Norma's message here for you, so that you can, if need be, stay in touch. It seems like she she's volunteering some people for you right now. All right. Well, thank you, Skyler, for joining us today.
Thank you for very important issue. I thank you for bringing attention to it.
Yeah, and thank everyone who has been attending these webinars. We're going on a break now. I'm really happy that we were able to leave you with something so powerful. And please do share, the video. This video is going to go up on YouTube in a bit, but in the meantime, do share the videos that you find on Skyler's websites and just continue spreading the word about this issue. All right, so happy holidays, happy end of 2020 to everybody. And that's it. All right.
Thank you, everyone.